Chica on here as well as Shaka, here to talk to Dr. Nafees Khan and Dr. David Eltis. So really happy to have them here with us today. Real quick before we even get started, please elaborate on what you do and your expertise, especially when it comes to slavevoyages.org.
All right. David, you want to go first? Or you want me to start?
No, you start.
All right. Well, I'll just say Nafees Khan, currently a content developer with Ralph Applebaum Associates, which is a museum design firm. But I've worked with Slave Voyages as worn a lot of different hats over the last, 17 years or so. But I'm part of the steering committee that kind of oversees the day-to-day operations and maintenance and updating of the site of the slave trade of Slave Voyages. And happy to be here and talk to you and kick it over to David.
Right. Hi. I'm retired, so I don't do anything.
Must feel good.
I'm also a member of the same group that Nafees is, and Nafees and I have been working together on this for more years. No care to count, but it's certainly over 20.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a retired prof, essentially. Yeah.
Right.
Originally at Emory. And I guess I'm currently associated with UBC, which is the University of British Columbia, which is why I'm 3 hours behind everybody else.
All right. Well, thank you again. So you're probably wondering, and I know Nafees, when I gave him that phone call, he probably was like, what in the world is going on, right? So here's the thing that's been happening on social media and other platforms. There's been a consensus beginning to build on social media. And it started about around 4 years ago on social media. But of course, this has been going on for a while now, and we want to address it. And it has to deal with the slave trade and the slave voyages of 1492. So I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima and his work, and about this idea that Africans at some point had ventured to America pre-Columbus. And so there's been a lot of talk with that. And so unfortunately, this argument has taken legs to the point where we are now having arguments or consensus around Black people not only being from Africa and coming to the Americas pre-Columbus, but there's an argument that's emerging that we are the actual Native Americans, okay, indigenous people, in the United States, in the Americas as a whole. Not only is this emerging, but this argument is also grounded in historical erasure. And so we have individuals who are actual Native Americans, American Indians, Aboriginals, however you want to call them, or however they call themselves, being isolated and being erased from history because of these arguments that we're seeing online. And in fact, Dr. Eltis, one of the reasons why we're bringing you, as well as Dr. Khan, to this platform is because they're using your words as a way to justify these particular arguments. And so we want to get the record straight for two reasons. Number one, we want to protect our ancestors. We want to protect the history that is grounded in our foundation as African Americans in this country. And furthermore, we want to set the record straight about the transatlantic slave trade, because again, there are people out here denying the fact that it even happened to begin with. And again, using your words to back it up. And so we're just going to cut to the chase here with the first question. And if you could, and I know this might sound very elementary, very strange, I'm even asking this question, but to both of you, who are the Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, American Indians, however you want to coin the term for those individuals? Who are they in the Americas? So in other words, when we say Native Americans, when you all say Native Americans or Indigenous Americans or Aboriginal, who are you talking about? Who are these individuals and how did they migrate to America?
So should I go first, Nafees?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Well, there's a grain of truth to this position. in the sense that we're actually all descended from black people, and obviously arrived in the Americas at different times. But there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Africans arrived before 1492. We've spent many years, obviously, associated not only with the Transatlantic Slave Trade database, but with a lot of scholarship before then. And from my perspective, I don't think it's been established at all that we had clear contacts between Africa and the Americas prior to 1492. That being said, go back to my first point, we're all descended from black people. It's I think broadly accepted that Homo sapiens left Africa first and spread to the rest of the world. And the point here is that they didn't reach the Americas until, well, there's different arguments about it, but you can say probably 20 or 30,000 years ago. So, yeah, I'm yet to be persuaded that there's been any contact at all prior to 1492. Nafees, do you?
Yeah, no, I would echo the same thing, and I think part of that, timing of, when you speak with different indigenous communities from the Americas, they oftentimes use the language of, I was trying to phrase it exactly right, but it's not millennia, it's time immemorial. That's the word, the phrase they often use when describing, their histories, their stories. It's from time immemorial, right? So if the exact dating of when people emerged out of Africa, Homo sapiens, as David mentioned, is it 20,000, 30,000 years ago? That part I think is we're looking for that record. But it's very clear that the different groups of people, they have their own identity, and very much so. It's not Africans in like 1000, CE or AD that were there prior to Columbus's contact with the Americans. There's just no evidence. So yeah, just echo what
yeah. And I maybe just add that we've done a lot of research on this issue, and we cannot find evidence in the 15th century of actual transatlantic crossings.
Okay.
So people will perhaps argue it anyway without evidence, but for me, there isn't any such indication.
Okay. And when we talk about this, just a side note, because again, I want to make sure that we clear up all kinds of misconceptions here. When we talk about Native Americans and American Indians, those terms are interchangeable, correct?
Yeah, pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I think as one of those things with identity is, the community that makes up, how they want to be referred to or how they call themselves. That terminology always continues to evolve, right? So you find, Native American kind of not going out of favor, but people referring to just Native or tribal communities or indigenous. And so I think there is a strong kind of sense of wanting to be identified themselves. They identify themselves. So not wanting to be, minimal or limiting in how people choose to identify themselves.
Yeah. And even with the arguments here, and I'm sure you see the book in front of you from Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. One of the arguments that he typically used in this book was the idea of the gold tip spears that apparently had been found. He said it was from Christopher Columbus, but of course we know from further research and understanding that this actually were the words of these were actually the words of Bartholomew de las Casas, right? Finding those gold tip spears and finding these people who he said were not unlike the Ethiopians, referring to Africans. How do we interpret that? How do we interpret that based on the time period of when of when Columbus and Bartholomew de las Casas and the other Spaniards and Portuguese individuals were coming to colonize this side of the world?
Well, yeah, I don't find the arguments in the book persuasive.
Yeah.
We've spent so much time in the archives, including the earliest Portuguese archives of the earliest Portuguese voyages, and there's just no evidence. I mean, I'm not sure what else I can say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we want to show you some clips just from some of the prior interviews that you've done with others. You did a really strong interview with Lipton Matthews, which we enjoyed watching. There's been a clip though from Lipton Matthews that we want to show you that we found on YouTube that's been circling around on social media. And so in this interview with Lipton Matthews, you mentioned something about Native Africans. And so we want to play that for you real quick and then get your feedback on what you meant when you were talking about this.
As a result of natural population growth.
Yeah.
The slave trade to the U.S. was shut down largely
back a little bit,
in
around 1328.
The main driver, 4 million people, those people did not come from Africa. They came as a result of natural population growth.
Yeah.
The slave trade to the U.S. was shut down largely in 1807, not completely, but largely. So if you look at the census data for the U.S. in 1870, which is when Black people were finally included, you'll find almost no Africans. They were, of course, Native African Americans. And that's not something that people have taken on board.
So after hearing this, and again, there's a lot of stuff circling around on social media, particularly TikTok and other platforms that are suggesting that, again, going back to our initial conversation about indigenous peoples, that you were talking about them. I want to make sure that we all get some clarity on this. When you said Native Africans and Native African Americans, who were you referring to?
Well, Native Africans are people born in Africa. That's a very simple, clear definition.
Mm-hmm.
African Americans clearly were not born in Africa. Well, for the most part, anyway, in the U.S. Right. So I'm not sure I can expand further on that.
Yeah. And so just to for basic understanding and clarity here, when you're saying Native African Americans, because you mentioned population growth, and this is going to go to a certain question here that one of my other guests are going to ask, or interview is going to ask. When you're saying Native African Americans, who are these Native African Americans? Where are they coming from? We know that they're born in America, but are they the offspring of Africans? Who are they?
Well, yes, obviously they have offspring from people who came from Africa. There's no question about that. But essentially that contact with Africa was severed with the Abolition Act, as I think the 1870 census information confirms.
Yep. And just to add one thing about that is, I think some of the work of, whether or not people were coming from the Caribbean, that could explain kind of this growth, even though the trade directly from Africa to the U.S. was, as David said, more or less severed following 1808. That growth, the number of people coming from the Caribbean doesn't explain fully a growth of over 3.5 million people in the next 40 or 50 years. right? So that's where that domestic population growth, those are kind of very seemingly benign terms, but those really, reference the exploitative nature of plantation slavery in the U.S. and that growth, right? That population growth, separating of families and the exploitation, in particular, of Black women during that time. That more readily explains this kind of large growth in the population in the U.S. Right, we're allowing U.S. to become the largest slave society, right, at the start of the Civil War by
Yep.
far, right,
Yeah.
larger than Brazil, even though Brazil imported a factor of 10, more people directly from Africa.
Yeah.
The U.S. would become the largest slave society that we've seen. And so,
And
yeah.
just to add to that, and to anticipate a related question that I think you had on the list, we think about 15% of the Africans that arrived in the Americas actually came via the Caribbean.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's over a period of probably close to 2 centuries.
And that speaks to the I'm assuming you're talking about the intra-American
Yeah,
slavery.
yeah, which is very important and has been misunderstood for many years, but I think now it's becoming clear how important it was.
Mhm.
In both directions. It wasn't just to the US, it was from the Caribbean to Spanish America.
Yeah. Hey, we're going to definitely mark that down on our paperwork, so to speak, for sure.
Let me ask a question real quick, teacher, if you don't mind. Is it loud or are we good?
It's a little muffled, a little bit.
Okay, I'll wait. I'm about to walk out. I'll wait. I got a question
Now I
for
can
you.
hear you. We can hear you now if you want to ask that question.
Okay, one of our viewers has a question. My brother Black First, he asked if is a website, do the researchers on the website, slavevoices.org, everybody that are involved with the research, do they use genetics to come to some conclusion as to where our people originated from? Sometimes do you use genetics at all in the research that you guys do?
We don't. Although I think it's worth mentioning that findings of the genetic group are consistent with what we are finding, even though we don't use the same techniques.
Okay. Okay, and the research that's done, is it dedicated to one people group, specifically us as African Americans, the descendants of African people coming over during the Transatlantic Slave Trade? Is the research done specifically for those descendants of slavery?
Yeah, I mean, one of the major features and probably most underused portion of the site is the data we have on the names of Africans that pulled into the slave trade. And this data actually is limited to the 19th century, but it allows us to actually say something about the origins of Africans, not just in terms of which port or which region in Africa they came from, but whereabouts within Africa they came from, because the names of individuals taken off slave ships were recorded in large bound volumes, mainly in the British records. And we've used that data to link the name with an ethnolinguistic group in Africa. And we've got something like 90,000 records. Mm-hmm. And this allows us to actually say something about the region in Africa that they came from. So we've got, and I should just push a new book here, but there's a second edition of the Atlas coming out this year, which actually contains diasporic maps of major ethno-linguistic groups leaving Africa and going to various parts of the Americas. Unfortunately, of course, it's precisely at that point that the slave trade to the US shuts down, and the diasporic maps don't tell you a lot about North American African Americans.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to also add one of the other elements that you see in looking at these names is the recognizable Arabic names.
Yeah,
And
no,
so you can infer and kind of represent the presence of Islam across Africa, right?
yeah,
Even though you can't pinpoint only one region because Islam was across West Africa by this time, but you do get a sense of Islam was well established across Western Africa, across the regions, and was involved in a lot of different ways as it relates to the slave trade. And so you very clearly can see names like Khadija, Fatima, Mahmoud, and
Mhm.
very easily recognized as Arabic origin names or Islamic names. But and it doesn't that and many other people who were Muslim had non-Arabic names too, but it does give you a very clear kind of presence, right, of Islam.
And that speaks to the so-called Moors being in America during the slave trade as well, right? When we're talking about Muslims
Mhm.
being in the United States as slaves.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
All
Yeah,
right.
but yeah. As I say, the problem is that we know that there's not that many Africans being carried off to the Americas after 1807, and that's precisely when we have the evidence. So, to be specific, Nafees has mentioned the Islamic faith, but we've also got diasporic maps for Mende, Yoruba,
mhm,
and Igbo,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I think for the first time allows us to get behind the embarkation point in Africa.
Yes.
Like Doctor,
I just, oh, go ahead.
uh, just one question, Tika. Now I'm going back down anyway. But Dr. Nafees and David, that was one point that I wanted to touch on. And thanks, Teach, for bringing it up. Is when you're dealing with the intra-American slave trade, particularly after 1808, can you speak to the illegal aspect of it, and then the demand for particular products, such as when you have a population that is in, I would say, like the upper South, whether it be Virginia and Maryland, and then moving them down to what we call the deeper South, and then the concept of a second slavery, where you have also the Africans also coming out of Charlotte and being migrating or being transferred to the islands such as Cuba and Jamaica for coffee and sugar.
Yeah, most of that traffic was, of course, to the U.S. deep south.
Right.
Um, it's not much traffic really going to the Caribbean at this point. But again, we've got very good data on the movement of people from upper south to the lower south, and that's available together with their names. Unfortunately, the names aren't African for the most part, but at least the data's there.
And and again, this is directly after 1808, where the international slave trade has been abandoned. And then,
Well, I wouldn't say abandoned. It's been attacked, but it certainly wasn't abandoned. It goes on for another 60 years.
okay,
Not to the U.S. especially, but of course to Cuba still.
this movement, what this movement is happening by land and also by sea. Is that correct?
Yeah, and of course we don't have data on movement by land. The key feature, the core concept with slave voyages, is the fact that any individual mentioned there has to have a connection with the voyage. And we can do a lot with that. But it clearly makes it impossible to do anything with the people that were sent by land, of which probably the majority, that probably includes the majority of people that moved, who were forced to move.
One of the kind of critical elements. I think, David, you had mentioned this years ago, but the amount of information for ocean-bound or, maritime trade,
Yeah,
because there's so many regulations, it was a business, right? And the
Yeah.
yeah,
business was moving people. And so they collected records. They documented it themselves of what they were doing. And so in many ways, there's just an immense amount of information, not all the information we'd like, right? Origins of people, who they were,
right.
right? But the fact that the ships had to go into ports, they had to be registered, they had to be, right, quarantined, inspected, that means there's records of those. And so it very clearly documents that way. Over land, as David was saying, it's a lot more, I don't know if spurious is the word, or not nearly. If you're traveling over land or by small rivers, people may not be regulating that, right? There may not be
Yeah,
patrols,
absolutely not. Yeah,
people coming in to say, how many are you bringing in? They're not, not to make it like light of it, but way stations on highways, right, for
Yeah.
trucks, right? There wasn't that, right? There wasn't that happening
right.
in the Central Valley or along the Mississippi River to the same extent. There
Yeah,
are some records, right? Because I think Washington University, there have been incidents that they were trying to document some of that overland trade, but it's
yeah. I
just,
mean, compared to the maritime movement, it's just about impossible.
yeah.
And I'm sure there's a tax involved in this also, right? Being that these people are moving from one location to the next.
Well, yeah, the taxes are usually something that were enforced on international movements
Okay.
rather than domestic.
All
I
right.
believe Tika has a question for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, and you guys kind of touched on a lot of my questions actually, but what I wanted to also that bears into what we come against a lot um, in these spheres is people constantly stating that there's no information, that everything's been hidden or it's been pushed aside or cast away. But being that you are, researchers and historians here in regards to that, my real question is like, given the extensive records of trafficked individuals and ports of arrival documented on the site and within your research as well, using this data in conjunction with modern genetic studies, like to reinforce like the ancestral link between
Mhm.
African descended populations in the Americas and specific regions or ethnic groups in Africa. I think that your research coupled with that genetic analysis would really be kind of um, a real sea change in how we as African descended people can really try and pinpoint, exact places of origin for ourselves. I really, I'm very interested in what you stated about the linguistics in regards to the people that the information that that you've captured in regards to specific names and things of that nature. That is fascinating. Will that information be in your new book? Um,
It's on. It's not. No. Well, yes, it is. But the more important point is that the data are actually up on slave voyages. It's,
okay.
it's just, and it's got a separate search engine,
Mhm.
and it's linked. Uh, every individual is linked to a particular voyage,
Mhm.
and it's not, in my view anyway, it's not being used sufficiently.
Mhm.
But the
Okay.
potential is there, and I think people should be using it more. However, having said that, the problem, of course, is that making links with the North American situation after 1807 is problematic.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thing about your about combining with genetics, something David mentioned earlier, but then also the idea that they really do complement each other, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
Continuing ongoing work with genetics. But one of the things that, not it's not a word of caution, but it's kind of understanding how the genetic testing is done, right? That they're doing comparison groups.
Mhm.
And so as the comparison groups become more robust and they're
Mhm.
gathering information of modern populations across Africa, across every region of Africa,
Mhm.
that will help be more accurate with people's doing their DNA tests. So they become more, so early on, much of the African comparison groups were from East Africa and I think South Africa early on. And so people were getting results that weren't as consistent with historical records and patterns. Not that one person couldn't have been that one exception, but that didn't really fit the pattern. And so I think as the genetic work has gotten a lot more widespread, that you're finding that the two types of research are really complementary of each other. And so it's kind of as the genetic kind of field continually gets better. Though that recent story about 23andMe needing to file Chapter 11, and those things are always concerning. So you always want to be mindful of that. But in general,
I understand what you're stating. It's just basically trying to increase the sample size on the continent in and of itself, so that we here as descendants can get a better snapshot as to who and where we descend from, really.
Exactly.
So I think that's awesome that we are going to be able now, as time moves on, as we move through, as technology improves, and also as samples as the sample size get bigger, we'll be able to kind of pinpoint with better accuracy as to who our ancestors directly are. When we are looking at various studies in regards to when we look at our DNA in comparison, for example, my DNA results reflect a large percentage of Nigeria. And the next is Benin and Togo, which goes along with the history of this transatlantic slave trade, because I'm originally from Jamaica. So when I'm looking at that information, I'm seeing that, the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, we have places in Jamaica we have Calabar in Jamaica as well. So it goes along, it fits along with the history, the genetics of it's I'm often fascinated by the correlation between the two, how that particular map of my autosomal DNA actually matches up with the transatlantic slave trade and the actual routes that were taken. It's quite fascinating to see it. And then what we often do within our groups is that we will we'll take a look in comparison, and what we'll find is African Americans, somebody like I think the question was fielded by Black First. He's from Detroit. His genetics look like my genetics. They look like they're coming from the same places, but we were just ended up in different regions of the Americas. And so that's why for us here, we want to make sure that people are understanding that when Professor Eltis was talking about Black natives, he was referring to the American-born descendants of Africans. That's what he was referring to. And I think that, once we have more people understanding that, we'll have more people being able to embrace their African ancestry.
Yeah, if I could you should note that the databases for DNA groups in Africa are very, very small compared to the rest of the world. That's a problem, but it's a problem that will eventually be resolved. And the prospects of making the kind of links you're looking for will be much stronger, I'm sure, 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And something else you mentioned, my family's also Jamaican as well. And, my mother, I tease her, but she's of an older generation. She's before even independence. But, she would say when in her time growing up, if they mentioned Africa at all, they would mention Ghana, right? And the Akan. And so the only association was with Ghana, right? And not with any other region of Africa. And, as you, start to kind of peel that back a little bit, there are definitely, ships arriving from Ghana for sure, but then, or the region that would become Ghana, but then also Nigeria, you see the strong presence, and even Angola, right, to an extent.
Yeah. So another Guinea was very important.
Right. So
it tends to get ignored.
It tends to get ignored. And so the kind of the mythology or how that collective memory of or assumptions around our origins tend to be kind of couched in these type of associations, even though it's generally much more complicated than like everybody's from one thing, or we're all from this group, or we're all from, right? You end up seeing that it's a much more broader stroke.
All right. I have a question to ask here. This is a question that we oftentimes get asked on our platforms as well, right? Where are the ships? Where are the ships? There's no way that this happened because there's no ships available, right? There's no tangible evidence, right, that a ship went from one area to the next, right? And so, are there any preserved slave ship vessels in Europe? So, for example, the Nightingale was a captured slave ship that was repurposed in some way. Are there what is the evidence surrounding that? What's the tangibles on those particular ships?
Well, a point to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a typical slave ship. Ships were taken from other lines of business and put into the slave trade. They could be modified fairly easily, often on the way to the African coast. So we shouldn't be looking for ship types. In my experience, we've got a vast range of types and also a vast range of periods in the slave trade. Many ships were used temporarily in the traffic and then went back to commodity traffic thereafter. I think someone asked about how long a ship would last. Well, a wooden ship wouldn't last too long, at least before they started putting copper plates on the hull, which is a late 19th century development, and they lasted a little longer at that point. But for the most part, I think a vessel would. It's unusual to find a vessel doing more than, say, 10 trips to Africa, and even 10 is quite a lot. It was wooden ships were relatively cheap, especially in North America. Lots of timber. Just about every port had a shipbuilding skill set to offer, and in terms of survival of those vessels, we just don't have it. We've got drawings, we've got pictures, but we don't have actual vessels that have survived.
I have another question too that oftentimes gets asked, and it's when you were just speaking to it actually, when you talked about the wooden ships, right, and their durability, especially when you start adding those copper plates. How long did it typically take to build these ships? And is there any information about how they were built, let's say in some of the European countries, of course, that were participating in the trade?
I actually don't think very many ships were built specifically for the slave trade.
Okay.
There was this vast range of types, and it's hard to generalize. Of course, by the second part of the 19th century, you get actually steamships surviving. And I think they've got a couple of dozen cases of steam vessels, all of them after 1850. But that can't be taken as typical for the traffic as a whole.
Yeah. And when it comes to the go ahead, Tika. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I would just say that because that's what we come up against a lot when we explain to people that, of course, these are wooden ships. These ships were repurposed and things of that nature, and that, that they weren't slave ships, they were merchant ships or cargo ships. And that's typically the reasons why, we kind of get people's heads kind of spinning because they don't seem to understand that it didn't say slave ship on there. It was literally a ship that was utilized to bring commodities, in and around this particular triangular trade, if you will. So
one thing just to add quickly, on the site itself, we had developed a couple of videos, animations based off of very detailed blueprints of French slave ships. the L'Aurore and the Marie Seraphique. And what it kind of shows you is how those modifications and how intentional the modifications are for the slave trade, right? That it, creating the placement of guns, the placement of cannons, or, well, small cannons, but guns towards the male captives, or separating the sexes, or how people are fed while they're on board ship and held in captivity, or where the chain most likely was, or the shackles, how those were housed. This big divider between that divided the ships, divided the men from women and children. This barricado, where this spiked barricade, right? You really start to see how the ships get modified for the trade, right? There's a real intentional around that. So, that those videos I think could be helpful in kind of seeing these are the types of plans and how they modified a ship that was built for another type of, or just built for commerce, but then modified, as David was mentioning.
And those ships were frequently modified on the way to the coast.
Yeah, on the way, yeah.
You'd have carpenters employed, and they'd put up the barricado and establish the slave deck. And then on the way back from the Americas, frequently that would be dismantled, and the vessel might go back into another trade altogether.
So I'm glad that you mentioned this, and I'm glad that you brought this up, because a lot of questions comes from, this idea of these manifests, right? There's always these manifests that are there that talk about the different slaves that are coming in, right? And when they're coming into port and disembarking and embarking. You guys have that laid out really well on your website. Where did you get these, just to be clear, where did you get these manifests? And on top of that, I know it's kind of a two-part question, but where did you get the manifests? And, do other countries like France, France, Spain, Britain, and other countries that took part in the trade, do they have these documents readily available somewhere also that you're pulling from?
Oh, absolutely. I think the current count is we've got 1,700 sources. And
that is
I'd
amazing.
say probably 2/3 of those are what we call primary sources. In other words, documentary sources. And they come. The big thing about the slave trade is that it was so international. A vessel going from Europe to the Americas would frequently pass through several jurisdictions, and in doing so, and a separate jurisdiction usually meant a set of documents. And we've been very fortunate. We've been running now for 30 years. We're very fortunate to recover documents, not just from a single source or a single country, but from several countries. And it's that which actually allows us to have a certain amount of certitude about the size of the traffic, because you can use these separate sources to check how the vessel was traveling. So we feel fairly confident about what we're saying.
And I think one other, and David, correct me if the statistic has been updated, but I think 80% or 86% of the voyages have at least 2 or 3 sources to corroborate, right? And some have more, but very few have only one. Like there's only one surviving record. But there are some, but I think overwhelming majority have multiple sources, and it's very easily to identify where which archives house it, or from where those records live, who's the possession of those. So from all over the world, right?
Plus there's archives of the individual slave traders.
Yep.
It's amazing.
If I may, just for a second, I just would like to give a shout out to OHF and Blackwater for the just the primaries, the word primaries, and you, Dr. Eltis, to say that loud and in 8K that the slavevoyages.org, the site is predominantly ran and operated by research from primary sources. This is something that we try to enforce on this app day in and day out. And sometimes I don't know if it's just the digestion of the primary source or the digestion of the truth behind the primary source, but it just seems that we have individuals who, for whatever reason, just don't get it. So for you to say that live right now is very powerful, but it's a testament to the individuals that we have on this app that on a day basis protect the history of our people, protect the history, just historical accuracy every day. And it's important, especially for young Black kids to learn about their history so they can have, like Dr. John Henry Clark says, a compass to the world, a compass to their future. They know where they come from. So they will live their life just a little bit differently, well, a lot differently, with a purpose, with a sense of self, a sense of history that they learned was denied to them, and just you know what I mean, just maybe walk better, like Marcus Garvey said, you know, once you learn the history of how beautiful we once were, you'd be more inclined to respect ourselves. So for you to say that on live, and it echoes what our brothers and sisters on this app do on a daily basis, that means a lot, man. That really means a lot, because that's what we try to do. Just stay on the right side of history and give as much as we possibly can with as much as we've researched, using primary sources to be unbiased, non-egotistical, but just telling the truth as it's laid out through research and study. So I appreciate that, Doctor.
Well, if I could just add to that, the site has one which I think is an unusual feature, which is that it accepts new information. In other words, we can't know everything. And we get, even today, 30 years down the road, we get emails pointing to sources that we haven't actually used. And we've got what we call a contribute page on the website, which encourages people to make these contributions. And the contributions are subject to editorial supervision, of course. Some of them don't turn out to be very accurate, but for the most part, they are useful. And that is a way of really ensuring, in the long run, the validity of the site, because we get more information every year from sources that we didn't even know about.
Yeah. I think each one of you has a question that he wants to ask as well.
Yeah, this is to Nafees and David. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the ships, and I know, David, you mentioned primarily in your book that a lot of this, you know, actually had to deal with, you know, business and transactions. Can you speak to the who owned the ships, and can you speak to also how much of the population was also involved in the economic aspect of it, as far as like owning stocks? You know, like today, you know, people own stocks in like Nike or whatever you have. Can you speak to that component of it? Because I think we have this misperception, like you have these big conglomerate of merchants and corporations, but I would just like to speak to like the small part of it.
Yeah, well, it's coincidentally, I'm currently working on a big database of owners of slave ships. And this actually, it's actually available on the site, although the search engine is not quite as sophisticated as I wanted it to be. But what's coming out from this is that we've got thousands and thousands of names of people who were organizing the voyage. And many of them left records, which we have actually incorporated into the database. So what's the conclusion that we got? Well, that it was ownership in the slave trade was very broadly based. There's a big emphasis on the big companies, especially Liverpool and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. But what's emerging from this new data is that there were a huge number of small investors. So when you're looking for those responsible for the slave trade, you're really looking at society as a whole rather than individual big guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one other thing that's always interesting that one of our colleagues, Greg O'Malley, had wrote an article years ago about Charleston, and I think he was writing about how the medical field within Charleston was so integral to the trade that, providing the quarantine, not just investigating, but when a ship arrived, inspected, right, and the related industries to the slave trade, right? There's like derivative industries, kind of how with automotive or oil, right? Makeup is tied to oil industry, right? Because of how the chemicals and plastics and things like that. So there you find that there's it kind of like a spider's web, right? It connects to much deeper throughout society, right? And as David mentioned, the very, very direct, investment and interest in the trade, it was very, very broad. But then also you have these related and more indirect ties to the trade that are harder to kind of speak at a global scale, but you find these like Liverpool, the related industries, or these ports that have they're very much tied to that economy as well.
Yeah, it is like a auxiliary business, like particularly like in the Massachusetts area, we have like rope makers and the fisheries and things that supported the Caribbean and things of that nature. Yeah, so yeah, that's just I wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Tika, I think Tika was.
I just wanted to expand upon that as well. And even within the slave trade in of itself, how interconnected all of these different entities were. Like, for example, we're talking about the New England fisheries. Well, they received sugar, rum, and molasses from the Caribbean, and in turn, they supplied the Caribbean enslaved people with cod, with salted cod, mackerel, things of that nature. That was the protein source for many of the enslaved people during that particular time, within the trade. It's fascinating in and of itself, right? To look at, like you stated, how many industries were spurned out of just dealing with the slave trade in and of itself, whether directly or indirectly. You take a look at a place like Bristol, and Liverpool as well. Those are major shipbuilding centers, but of course, within that, you get bars, you get places for people to stay, like rooming houses. Then it builds tea houses, and people then go from there. So we're looking at a large economy that comes out of one particular industry. And in fact, I often like to state to people that this is what really kind of spurs the engine of the global economy in and of itself. Is just the slave trade was that influential in that aspect. So I'm glad to have this conversation with both of you all. This is fantastic.
So we have I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Eltis.
Well, just to stress the wide involvement in the traffic, I just wanted to mention recent research, especially in the South Atlantic, which shows that the owners of slave vessels actually paid their crew members by giving them a share of a slave. In other words, rather than pay wages, they would actually identify an individual, link an individual crew member with a particular one or two slaves, in some cases a portion of a slave, and that was the pay. Now, what the big dramatic finding here is that many of the crew members were actually black, and indeed some of them were not just black, but they were black slaves. And nevertheless received payment for their services, and that payment came in the form of a part of a human being. And that's
Now,
something I find overwhelmingly sad, but there it is.
what in terms of those particular people, were they, manumission? Did we know, or were they just?
No, some of them are outright slaves of the slave owner. The thing to keep in mind is that Brazil was not as well, shall I say, capitalized as Europe at that point. They found it tougher to bring together the financing that would support a voyage, but this was a solution to the problem, and it's been totally ignored in the literature. All the information that we have comes from the North Atlantic, and it stresses the big guys, the big companies, Royal African Company, South Sea Company. But I do want to stress there's a level of involvement which I don't think historians have fully appreciated, which extends to ordinary people.
Okay.
Some of them enslaved themselves.
So that particular phenomenon, was that just in South? When you're talking about Brazil, or was that?
Yeah, it was not. Yeah, I've never seen that used in the North Atlantic. I mean, most of the research that's been done is on the North Atlantic. It's the British and the French and the Portuguese. But far more, it seems that more vessels actually set out from South America to Africa than set out from Europe to Africa. And this is not something that's recognized either in the literature or in the popular discussions.
So we saw another interview with you, and I know you're probably like, man, another one, but we want to address this because you just did it. We just saw an interview that you did with the BCU Big Cat University, and it was legendary Top Cats. Do you recall?
I don't.
Okay, can we show a clip of that?
But your descendants are also slaves. And I, as I said a few minutes ago, I don't find any case at all in any part of the Americas where a European not only became subject to lifetime servitude, but also had the basic problem that any subsequent offspring would also be in the same status. That's what chattel slavery means to me.
Okay, so I agree with you on that, Dave. So the people who are the chattel slavery is upon, in my research, will be the indigenous people of America.
Yeah, that's for sure.
4 million people they're speaking about during the time of the Civil War, 18.
Okay.
Yeah. So when he was talking about that specific group, what was he? How did you interpret that? For one, did you see it as him talking about indigenous Americans or individuals who were African that were being brought in, or being born in Africa? So going back to our initial question and our initial prompt that we were talking about, the African Americans, the native African Americans on the continent at that time through population growth.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1870 census, there's about 1% or less of individuals who are African. So we have 4 million, almost 4 million people enslaved, and they're, for the most part, born in the Americas, or more specifically in the U.S. There is no case, as I mentioned in that clip, where even the Irish were actually not just enslaved, but had offspring that were also enslaved, and their offspring too would be enslaved. There's no substantive evidence of that at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Enslavement was definitely racial.
Yes. Because a lot of people like to conflate the whole indentured servitude with slavery.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
We
We all know.
we know that, but
Yeah.
we come against a lot of people who are saying, well, it's indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was something contractual in that sense. The vast difference between that and chattel slavery is that chattel slavery became synonymous with people of African descent. And of course, with the fact that you're enslaved in perpetuity, because once you were born to an enslaved person, you were enslaved as well.
Yeah, and we have a group that meets once a week, and usually there's a question that's been submitted by someone from usually not an academic background, and the typical question is, what about the Irish slaves?
Mhm.
Why aren't you dealing with those? And basically we kick around who has to answer it, because we've done it so often
It's unbelievable.
that we don't really want to do it anymore.
It's unbelievable. And would you argue, and this is for both of you, would you argue that those points are typically grounded in white supremacy? A lot of it, to try to equate or to try to diminish the fact that America and all the other European countries that were involved in the slave trade had an extensive hand in bringing Africans to the Americas.
Yeah, I mean, the Irish have a lot to be sorry about in history, obviously. They're exploited in many ways the same way in which Africans were. But I've yet to find a case of an Irish slave in the sense that the offspring of that individual was also a slave. I've just never happened to come across such a case in 40 years of research.
Yeah. Dr. Eltis and Dr. Nafees, while we're at it, and I know that, your time is precious, but we might as well just go ahead and address all the pseudo, okay? We need to just go ahead and address all the pseudo, no more pseudo, right? And so I think that speaks to the fact when you're talking about these individuals being from Africa, right?
Yeah.
And slavery being based on race, especially if we're looking at in terms of the Americas, in terms of America after Bacon's Rebellion, that would also mean that this idea of Black Scots, like Black rulers of England and Scotland and Wales, it didn't happen.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Just wanted to get another fellow historian on the record to confirm that.
So we can confirm that people of African descent aren't the Tudors, and people have actually been claiming this. Yes, I know.
Yeah, the Tudor family, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, but these are the type of things that we are coming up against. So yeah. So
well, keep up the good work. Push back.
I appreciate it. We appreciate it.
I'd like to just to piggyback off that, just to because I think right now we're definitely cooking up pseudo stew, and we are really doing a great job. Rebels, like let's get it, but we're doing a great job of dispelling any misinformation, any myths that have been just spoken so confidently through lies and manipulation. But this is one that I'm pretty sure is going to be another head scratcher for you guys, since we have you here and you've specifically and clearly let us know, just articulated that you use a lot of primary source research to bring us this information that's on the site. However, this is one other myth that we need to dispel while we have you guys here. We have a group of individuals who follow an individual, and I'm not going to even give him credence to even say his name right now, but who are pushing a narrative that slave trade happened in reverse. The
What?
slave trade I love that response. Thank you for that response. That was actually epic. Matter of fact, let me turn my camera on so we can talk face to face. Yeah, so the slave trade happened in reverse. And no, we're not talking about the American Colonization Society. We're not talking about those three entities, the slave the masters, the slave masters, the segregationists, and the abolitionists. We're not talking about those three. We're not talking about the American Colonization Society. We are talking about a group of individuals who follow a grifter who has made a lot of money on the misinformation of our people. That the slave trade happened in reverse. In reverse. Is there any documented genetic evidence? Just bear with me. I know, trust me, I know, but just for the sake of just some of the young, maybe 18-year-old, 17-year-old that follow this page that may be listening, we want to make sure they get this and just grow up on the right side of history. But is there any genetic, any anthropological, any archaeological evidence whatsoever that would suggest or be a fact that the slave trade in any way, shape, or form happened in reverse, sir? I'll go on mute.
Do you mean that that Africans were taking Europeans to Africa, or
I know it's hard. I know it's hard. It's baffling, but no.
No.
Yes, everything I'm saying to you, please just believe it. Yes, what you're thinking is what they're saying. The transatlantic slave trade happened in reverse. In reverse, meaning there were black people, as we know what the definition of black is, but they're not sub-Saharan African descent. These are black Indians who are indigenous to the Americas prior to colonialism, with no empires, no artifacts, no DNA research, no history, no freedom fighters, no nothing, that they were taken from America to Africa.
And then what happened?
Yes.
Man, that's classic. I cannot wait to make sure this is posted.
Oh my God.
Thank you for that answer. I'll go back on mute. I just had to give you that. That is something that individuals, as you see on the screen, I don't know if you can see it,
Yeah, I can
that
see
are
it.
making. Go ahead, sir.
No, I'm speechless.
Uh-huh. So was I when I first got on this app and I started hearing some of this nonsense. I had no idea that it even existed until I joined up on this app. But it's been going on for a while.
It's unfortunately, this has been clearly a source of I mean, yes, we're laughing, but it's been a source of somewhat sadness in and of itself as well, because so much of our history is being you know pushed to the side, disrespected, and the work that you all do has also, as the old saying goes, if you repeat a lie, more than once, it'll start becoming the truth, if you will. People are really starting to believe these things, and and the work of historians like yourself is being lost to a narrative that is suiting people who are just looking to earn money off of the fact that some people, for whatever reason, want to buy into these particular narratives. So I personally want to thank you all for doing your research and for going out there and finding this information, documenting this information, so that we ourselves can reference materials and explain how primary sources work to people, how it is that you can quantify evidence with whatever that you're searching for. This in particular is, I think it stems from, in many regards, because of the history of slavery. I think for some people within our community, they want to see a different narrative. they want to be on the side of, no, that didn't happen to my people, and maybe there's some sort of alternative history to that. My constant, the thing that I like to explain to people is simply this: was that there were empires in Africa,
Yep.
many great civilizations and empires in Africa. And we need to be proud of that, and European exploration of the world was something done out of necessity, you know, and for that reason, because they had large ships and armadas, people feel as if, technologically or in some way, shape, or form, Africans just weren't. What we're trying to state is that Africans didn't have the capacity to do those things. It's not that they didn't have the capacity. It's just that for that particular time period and for their particular civilization, it was not a need. They had variously all of the resources, or most of the resources that they needed, and Europeans traveled because of the fact that they wanted several resources that weren't readily available to them and were only accessible through like the Ottomans and Ottoman Empire and the Genoese. So they wanted to go exploring the world in order to get those things for themselves. And
there's no shortage of white slaves, but they went in the Atlantic.
Nafees, I have a really strong question for you, in particular. And after hearing a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, number one, the first, have you heard these claims before? But number two, as someone, just to set this up in your positionality as a person who is from the Caribbean or has ancestry in the Caribbean, how do you handle and respond to these particular arguments as a Black man living this experience, as a Black man that's grounded in the Caribbean? How do you combat these things that people are saying, books that are being written like this, the narratives that are being shared that rip apart the history of the diaspora? Like, how do you handle that in your paradigm, especially as someone who is a professor and who has to live in these spaces that are, again, grounded in white supremacy?
So, I mean, I think two things. One, some of them, some of these types of questions, Irish slavery or what about kind of framings come up often in a lot of different spaces. Most of my until I started working in museums, I was in education, right? I was in teacher education, so preparing teachers and working with teachers and students and whatnot. And my disposition is always to listen and understand somebody's point. But if they want to learn, if they're trying to understand and they're curious, they've heard something. So if they're coming from a genuine place of curiosity, I'll always engage, right? Always engage and inform as best I can, point in directions to understand how you critique or assess information and spurious claims. But if somebody is coming just to hear themselves talk, or I've given presentations before where somebody wanted to ask a question just to hear themselves say, about what about Irish slavery, what about the role of some of the other ones. Well, that's the one that comes to mind often. Or not just Irish slavery, but the idea of weren't we all just, everybody was treated bad, so why do we have to distinguish it, right? Or which was worse, the Holocaust or slavery, right? Those type of arguments, which to me always have a particular, that person generally has their decision already made. And so, what's worth my time, really, right? What's worth my energy? The educator in me is always wanting to help somebody, right? Yeah. But if they're not wanting to engage, it takes I thank them for their question and move on. But engaging in arguments or back and forth, it's right. If I feel somebody is really curious or they've never encountered what the evidence shows, welcome. Let's have a conversation if that's what they want to have. But if they're trying to hear themselves, then it comes up time and time again. I will say one of the things that, not about kind of conspiracies, but just as as someone who is Black and kind of engaging, with this work, one of the things that I'd even written about once of, understanding how slavery and the slave trade took place on the continent itself, right, on the African side, how the trade kind of operated, right, who was involved, the differing kingdoms, the differing traders. One of the things that you kind of have to sit with is the fact that Africans were very much involved in the trade, right? And I say that in that framing of you have to sit with it, right? This is not to excuse the perpetrators of the trade by any stretch, right? The Europeans who and Americans who were the ones kind of demanding in trade, but you have to sit with the fact of who's actually delivering the slaves to the port, who's bringing them over land or over river to those ports, who's capturing them for the trade. And there's also resistance that happened on the continent, right? There was pushback. There was resistance against other African kingdoms. There was. It's not a single story on the continent, and I think that's something to really kind of sit with, right, and kind of wrestle with and understand, and not to say, oh, it's not white people or it's not black people, or it's one or the other. No, you got to sit with how global of a trade this was, right, and the racialized component shouldn't be undercut, right? I mean, we oftentimes hear slavery has been around since ancient times, which is true, right? The idea of coerced forced labor has, but the racialized component that evolved in this era is something that was particularly unique. And the fact that David mentioned before, of not just your condition, but your children's conditions would be followed through. That part, which when it's connected to the racialized element to it, is really a critical element, a critical facet to hold, and understanding this form of brutality and this form of coerced labor from other forms of brutal coerced labor, which we have a plethora of examples in every corner of the globe, right? Other peoples have been suffering, but if we don't understand unique circumstances, we flatten their experiences, right? We do a disservice when we say, well, the brutal conditions that Irish people suffered is just like slavery. Well, no, it's not, right? But it's still brutal, right? You can recognize people's pain without trying to create everybody was suffering in the same way, which just isn't the case, right? And I think actually one of the next kind of expansion of the database is looking at the trade in the Indian Ocean. And one of the elements that kind of brings up, it raises very different questions. It's very new questions, right? But in the trade of Africans being sent across the Indian Ocean, but also you start to see the presence of Chinese women being forced into sex trade, into trafficking in other capacities. And you just start to see, all right, how do you understand it? How do you put them in context? How do they relate to each other if they do? So it raises new questions in that sort of way. I will say, my colleague and I, Daniel Dominguez, we're talking how, so my father's from India, right? So my mother's from Jamaica, my father's from India, and unintentionally, right, there's a familial connection to both oceans, if you will. And I hadn't thought about it in that way, but it does represent, the globality of the trade, right? And so how I view my positionality, if you will, is one of, how do we understand this, right? How do we process it? How do we sit with it, right? And it's something that's always ongoing, right? It's not a static thing, a static feeling.
Even like the illustration is on the screen. Like I always try to kind of periodicals.
Tika, I think you might be having some technical difficulties. Can you all still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
yep.
Can you?
You were cutting in and out, Tika.
Oh, can you guys hear me still?
Yeah, now we can.
Now we
Is
can.
everybody okay? Can we hear? Everyone can be heard?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Teaching, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Is everything
Yep, go ahead.
going okay?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
You might have to drop and come back.
Oh, me? Okay, no problem.
Yeah. You might have to drop and come back because it's going in and out. But each one, did you have something to ask or add? Up, you're muted.
Yeah, I wanted to ask David specifically, have you been able to find any record of African merchants on the West African coast and add that to the database?
Yep, we've got pretty well hundreds of trade books. That's the records that European slave traders kept when they arrived on the African coast and were trying to assemble a cargo of people as quickly as possible. And in those trade books, we have references to individual African sellers of slaves. And I mentioned earlier that I was currently working on the ownership of slaves and slave ships. And we've been able to incorporate that information about African sellers in with the rest. And the interesting finding is that there's a similar pattern on both sides, in that, of course, there's big guys that people have heard about. In the African case, King Dahomey. But in fact, there's a large number of small sellers of slaves. And it seems to us that the important role in Africa played by African rulers was not so much selling people, but as creating an environment in which trade could take place. And as a result, we have evidence of far more people selling slaves than we had previously.
Wow.
If you give me, I'll send you the paper when it's finished.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just tap back into that just a little bit more. Just on the African side, do you find, because in my research, I find the term interlopers. Is that
Yeah.
okay? Is that
Interlopers,
individual people actually, or individual groups outside of larger city states and things of that nature?
Yeah, obviously there were European companies like the Royal African Company or the Middleburg Company, who were very large traders. But at the same time, there was usually space for individuals, and some of them were not legal because Royal African Company had basically a monopoly granted by the British Crown. But the term interlopers comes from the fact that there were many vessels trying to break that monopoly. So we have the Europeans trying to establish a monopoly and a large number of other Europeans who were trying their best to break it. And that term interloper comes from that kind of context. By the time, let's say by 1720 or 1730, there was no attempts to monopolize the trade had pretty well halted because it was not working. And for the period when the slave trade was busiest, in the second half of the 18th century, it's really what we would call free trade. Monopolies simply don't work.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, all right. We wanna wrap this up with a Q&A, if you don't mind. And the reason why we want to do this, and we definitely want to get both of your input on these questions. There are some people that want to ask some questions that, again, are a little confused about the slave trade. And they have, again, alternate theories about it. They want to get their questions resolved. So if you will do us the indulgence of actually addressing some of those questions, I want to bring up Shaka. Shaka had those questions on his camera, on his own. Each one is Shaka in the platform. Oh, there we go.
Oh, I was sitting there talking to myself. Okay. So for those of you who are in the comments, I see that you still have a hard time. You are having a hard time hearing the truth from two individuals who are in the field of study, who are the contributors to this website that has gathered tons and tons and tons of data, primary source data, to help us map out our history. So I'd like you guys to get a chance. You pretendians, you pseudos, I'd like you guys to get a chance to get your question out to an expert. So you put the question in the chat, and each one is on the back end. He can put the question up, if he can, put the question up that I read out. But go ahead and type out your questions. And I'd like you guys to get a chance to be heard by these experts up here on the panel. So, any takers, go ahead and type it in. Can you ask him if there were indigenous people? Okay, let's see. You have one. Can you ask him if there were indigenous people that may have resembled Africans? Because if so, people will still claim to be indigenous. Oh, that's not an opt question, but so the question is, are there indigenous people that may have resembled Africans? Because, or are there indigenous people that may have resembled Africans? Anyone can answer.
I suppose it's theoretically possible, but
is there evidence? Excuse me, that's what he wants to say.
I mean, I think the sources make it clear in almost every case what the origin or what the background of an individual is. And I don't see any evidence of indigenous peoples being mistaken for African.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Don't see any other questions. Ask if they looked like you, Idris Elba. Man, that gets. That gets. Let's see. So, some of the individuals that had questions or said that we were asking questions to fit our narratives are quiet now in the comments. I apologize for the dead air, but yeah, I can ask him about. Okay, here we go. Ask him about Melanesian DNA and Papuans in America, 10,000 years old. They look like black poodle. I don't know what that is, but let me look like black people. Okay. Ask him about Melanesian DNA and Papuans in America.
Papua New Guineans.
Papua New Guineans.
Is that what he was trying to spell? Lord,
yeah, Papua New Guineans.
Yep.
All right, can you answer that question? Ask him about Melanesian DNA and Papua New Guineans in America, 10,000 years old. They look like black people. Have you guys been privy to this information?
It's news to me.
Yeah, they weren't. I never heard them being in America.
Right.
America. No.
Okay.
And the most important part of that argument is that, genetically speaking, they're not us. They're not
right.
They're not Africans. That's the thing. Their DNA is closer to Asian people than they are to us.
That's right.
I think, unfortunately, what we have is that a lot of people tend to conflict. They put together the history of human migration with modern human history. They look at these migratory patterns and they say, oh, we all descend from Africa. But what people fail to understand is that, adaptation, people, move, migrate, and settled in certain regions and areas. And because of different climatic changes and dietary things and things like that, being situated where you are on the planet, you develop certain phenotypes, certain, a lot of things change. So unfortunately, this whole, we have to constantly combat, this whole thing of, well, they look like us, but they're not us. They're not African people. We are, descended from West and Sub-Saharan Africans.
Correct.
We're not Papua New Guineans. We're not Melanesians. Yeah.
I mean, how do we know what people from 10,000 years ago looked like?
Yeah.
So can you say that? Can you say that one more time, Dr. Eltis? Can you say that one more time, please?
Well, I'm just wondering how it's possible to have an accurate image of what people looked like 10,000 years ago.
Your question is as good as ours. We have been trying to figure these things out for such a long time, but yet it seems as if we have individuals who manifest pictures that belong to other people and other events in history as to be the evidence, I guess. Let's see. Does Mr. Eltis know the recent interview he did with? No, we already went through that, bro. You're late. We really don't have any any other questions. I think they're giving up. The ships have sailed. Shaka, please do not read. No, I don't. I won't read those. Ask about history of Portuguese sending slaves. Yeah. Well, it looks like they've thrown in the towel. But what I like to say is I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come on here, because what we do, again, is important. It's really important. A lot of people try to pass it off as something that's minuscule, but it's important because it's, like I said, it's a lot of young brothers and sisters walking around, especially in the divided states of America, not knowing who they are. Yeah. And it's due to, like Dr. Joy DeGrasse speaks of in her book, the post-traumatic slave syndrome, not having a chance to really receive true therapy. And that trauma has been passed down just years and years and years, to the point where we have individuals now out in the open making millions of dollars, lying to our people, saying things as rudimentary as the transatlantic slave trade happened in reverse. I mean, come on. And then the font in the book is to the left and too big, but that's another story. Just the fact that it even exists and it's possible is due to our people, the diaspora as a whole, not knowing the history. And like Dr. John Henry Clark says, the missing pages in world history is our history. So I just really appreciate what you do. And when I first saw the site, I'm not gonna lie to you. Maybe that first week, because I took a whole week to stay on the site and go through the site for at least 30 minutes a day. And I could not go through the site without being in tears. So I really, truly appreciate what you guys have done on the site and what it does for us, and the detail, hitting those little ships, and you can read those manifests. Like that's really it's powerful. And then the way you guys source everything at the bottom, just powerful. So I really appreciate what you guys have done, and it's a honor to be able to be on the same panel with you guys talking to you. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just one thing. Well, sorry, I was just going to say, just on that was, from the early years of this project of putting it online, making the database online, was to make sure that this information didn't just live only for historians, only for people who knew the history already. We wanted, from the inception, those first conversations, to make it as widely available and accessible. And that's kind of the ongoing work is, can we do the search a little different? Can we display the tables a little different? Can we provide a time lapse or maps or videos to help make this information more digestible and get people to play with the site and unpack all the information there? Because as you know, the first time I encountered the CD-ROM, I was overwhelmed with, this is so much, I don't know what to do. You kind of like, what's the first thing? And so that is something that we've wanted to make sure that we're not gatekeeping in any way, right? That this is very much open, freely, and approachable in a way that and provides enough context for people to unpack.
Yeah, I second what you're saying.
Yeah.
I do have a hard stop. So I don't know. I'm sorry to have to do this, but I do have another call to jump on.
No, I was actually going to wrap this up. Actually,
all right, no worries. No worries.
No, you're good.
If I may, I just wanted to thank both of you for being here, Dr. Khan, Dr. Eltis. This has been, really impactful in regards to what's taking place today. In regards to you guys coming here and speaking with us, we do appreciate it, and answering all of the questions, not only from ourselves but from people in the audience as well. So thank you both for all your hard work and dedication in regards to the site. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. And I second that. And for all of our affiliates out there as well, and those of us who just have an interest in history, again, we appreciate the work that you've done. We appreciate the things that you're doing right now for the African diaspora in terms of the information that you guys are providing. And please keep in touch with us because we want to learn more, and we want to make sure that we're getting everything that we can to support the history of our diaspora. So
okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Those of y'all listening, y'all take it easy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.